Welcome to the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, psychology student and international best-selling psychology author of over 30 psychology books, bringing you the latest psychology news, fascinating psychology topics and more each week. If you want to learn more, then please check out connorwhiteley.net/books. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube video or follow on your favourite podcast app. And here's the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 283 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's episode is on how does trauma affect the heart? And it is Thursday, the 15th of August 2024 as I record this. So the reason why I wanted to do today's podcast episode is I've been writing so much about trauma lately, not for the podcast, but for another project and for one of the upcoming psychology books. And it got to today, today though, so I knew I was going to come back to Medway to record the podcast, and I was thinking, right, I haven't got an actual blog post for today's episode. I want something quite easy. I want something I can write about relatively simply. There was one topic I was going to write, but then I was like, that's really long. There was another topic, but I was like, this hits way too close to home in all the wrong ways, so I can't manage that, even though it's such a fun episode that I really want to do, and it's so innocent, but it's one I really, really want to do at some point. But then another bit of research that I had, or something on my list, was how trauma affects the heart, which is a brilliant podcast episode because we always think about this, and I'm no exception to this. Whenever we think about psychological trauma, we always think about the psychological consequences. For example, PTSD and panic attacks, social anxiety, and all of the other things that I'm basically dealing with at the moment. So you've got that, but what we don't think about is physiological impact of psychological trauma, which I mean was fascinated. And as soon as I realised that, I was like, oh yeah, no one does think about. But it turns out there's actually a growing amount of evidence of which actually says that trauma has a massive impact on our physical health, not only our mental health, which was just brilliant to look at. And I loved today's episode. It was a lot of fun to write about. So in today's podcast episode, we talk about why does trauma impact the heart and our cardiovascular systems, what are the consequences of this, and I also talk about some directions that we could take just so we could apply this research into the applied settings and our mental health and medical settings. This was a lot of fun. I love this episode. I know you're going to enjoy it too. So you got that to look forward to in the content part of today's episode. So moving on to the psychology news section, we're reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest. And the first one is Self-Censorship, Controversy and Taboo in Psychological Science. Taboo topics exist in most academic fields, but in psychology they can be particularly powerful. Fears of speaking up, sharing findings that challenge the status quo, or publishing findings that may harm particular demographics can mean researchers don't necessarily know what their peers think about these topics. These academics do know what some leading journals think about this though. In 2022, a Nature Human Behavior editorial, for example, indicated that a paper could be rejected if it potentially causes harm to a specific group. While these policies seek to limit any negative fallout from scientific inquiry, Corey J. Clark at the University of Pennsylvania and a long list of colleagues at mostly American universities note that some scholars have raised a different concern about a threat to academic freedom stemming from a fear of causing harm to vulnerable groups. So, How do psychology researchers actually feel about these taboo topics? Do they self-censor their beliefs? And what should happen to scholars who communicate research that might fit the bill of being potentially harmful to disadvantaged groups? Okay, so if you want to read what the BPS has to say about this, definitely check out Emma Young's Ladies a Feature. Well, that is quite interesting though. So, I mean, like, this is definitely something that I've suffered from this podcast, because whenever I do episodes on certain topics, I always get hateful emails. There is YouTube comments I have to delete. It's ridiculous, to be fair, though. I'm just attacked so badly, and I'm not actually saying anything controversial. I mean, like, yeah, I mean, like, this podcast has got me a lot of stick over the past few months. But the reason why I'm saying that is that on one hand, you will get attacked for whatever you say. For example, like I say stuff that's backed up by tons of like a literature in terms of clinical psychology, in terms of modern healthcare. I'm not saying anything controversial, but because of certain groups of people get angry by what I say, and like because of the mainstream media is quite against a certain topic that I cover on this podcast every few months, it's literally a case of people will just hate me for saying for just saying what's based on research. But on the other hand, though, so even though stuff I say doesn't hurt certain groups, it's actually protecting certain groups. What is interesting is this idea of self-censorship and the idea of controversy and taboo, though, because I do a lot of research on transgender mental health, though, and to be honest, I have no idea why that's classed as taboo or controversy. But even though I research it, even though I'm actively communicating with members of the transgender community, and I'm non-binary myself, so well, but the always is that a pressure just has to make sure that anything that I do find or say won't harm like my own group. Well, thankfully, nothing's ever like come up, and that would ever harm the trans community, though. But I think it's very interesting the idea that people might self censor or people get angry that they have to censor their beliefs just because it harms a particular group that were because I've seen some very interesting studies, especially from the early days and the last century, about like the mental health of like gay people, about how people come to be gay, and basically tons of so-called academic research, also known as pseudosciences, aimed at the LGBT plus community, and that harms us. That really does, though. Like a lot of sort of homophobia that I've heard, also transphobia, lots of stuff that made my life absolute hell was all based on what so-called academics said about people from the last century. Yes, academic research does have very big consequences, so we've got to be careful. And I think that, yes, of course, we need to protect academic freedom, but if it does harm a group, if it does bias the population against a group that's already struggling for their rights, for their right to survive, for their right to equal healthcare, hell, you only have to look at America to see how badly the transgender debates are going over there. So my point is that we need to strike a balance between giving academics the freedom to research whatever they want and find the scientific truth which is different from the real truth, because there's no such thing as true scientific truth. It's just like what you can support with your hypotheses. But at the end of the day, though, science is meant to help people. It's meant to protect people. It's meant to tell people the truth about how stuff works, though. So if there are findings that harm an innocent population, that is something we've got to tread carefully about, though. And my last example was to take a step away from the trans and the LGBT plus community. Well, if we look at black people, the so-called science, so-called academic research that showed that black people aren't as intelligent as the white people. That wasn't research whatsoever. That was just pure racism labeled as academia. So, of course, I'm not saying that these days we're as bad, but it just goes to show that you've got to be careful with academic research and proclaiming something as a true, because it could have negative impacts for centuries to come, though, because that's still something that I still hear out on the streets. It's flat out wrong and it's flat out disgusting, but people still believe that black people aren't as intelligent as white people because of academic research done last century. So it's just something to think about. So the second one is the new trade on the block. Most of us have an intuitive idea of what facial behavior entails and the benefits of being a master of it might convey. A stoic egg expression certainly has its advantages in poker, for example, but the majority of us can deploy a well-timed smile when at the moment calls for it. Studying facial behaviors, however, has historically been tricky, as Ian Kellard and colleagues note in their latest paper. Humans have the most complex facial musculature of any animal, and capturing all of that movement and meaning in a decently sized sample size has previously been too time consuming to be workable. In their new study, published last month in Scientific Reports, the team used AI-powered software to take some of the first steps towards quantifying facial behavior. By combining this method with human judgment, they find the evidence of facial egg expressiveness a stable individual difference, and that those with more egg expressive faces enjoyed varied social advantages. Okay, so that's actually quite brilliant, though, because I'm autistic, and I mean, for a lot of autistic people, facial expressions always interesting, always a good a topic there. And since I've become more aware of it, sometimes when I'm talking to an autistic person, it's really good, or it's almost mildly entertaining, but just to see the mismatch between their words and their face, though, because I mean, my best friends, love them to death. Though, they can say they're really excited, they're really happy, they're really looking forward to something. Most of the time, you can tell it in their facial expressions and they're really visibly excited and they're shaking with excitement. But sometimes they say it with such a blank expression, I have to check if they're being sarcastic at me or not, because that's something else I can't tell. So I definitely understand how having a more expressive face is a definitely something that does bring more social advantages, because I think it does mean that you can fit in with social groups more, and social interactions are just so much easier. But to focus on the methodology aspect, using artificial intelligence, I know I've mentioned stuff in this podcast before about how there are pros and cons, but it's good to see that there is some advantages of AI. Of course, I'm more interested in the ethical concerns about how they're trained, but I will park that idea for. But it is good that we're starting to use artificial intelligence to help advance our understanding. And I think when it comes to science, artificial intelligence could be a powerful force for good, as long as we use it in conjunction with human collaboration. So the last one is, can apps really help us live healthier? On a health kick, there's an app for that. Whether you want to improve your diet, up your step count, or work out more, downloading an app can be one helpful way of helping you reach your goal, or at least make it more reachable. According to a new study comprising data from 206,873 participants, though, downloading such apps might actually be doing more than just make us feel on the ball with our health goals. Analysing the results of nearly 50 studies on digital health interventions, a global team finds that on the whole, apps can help us move the needle on an array of diet, health, and sleep goals. Okay, so this is actually quite a brilliant one. Like two main reasons. Three. So the first one is that I completely agree that apps can be really good though, because my best friends are gone back up but to the Midlands to see family though. So I'm at home alone this whole week, and I think I am for at least another 2 weeks. And that means that it means I can do lots of steps around the house, which means that I'm aiming to do 10,000 steps a day. Now, of course, you cannot count 10,000 steps yourself, especially when you're listening to music or a podcast. So, downloading an app is really helpful. And because I've got my step counter app on my phone, then it actually means that I can check out my progress, and it gives me the motivation to actually get moving though. Secondly, my sister-in-law, she's actually doing a 10,000 step a day challenge at the moment, and I mean she's actually doing really well. I'm actually quite impressed with her. I didn't think she would get 9 days in. And every night on a Facebook, even though I really don't check her Facebook every night. Yeah, but what she does is that she posts her final step count for the day, and that's really good though, because you can see that it's given her the motivation, and it's also given her kids the motivation to try and live healthier lifestyles, which is brilliant. Finally, during my placement years, that might have been 3 years ago now. Yeah, wow, almost 3 years ago. One of the projects I did was something to do with mobile mental health apps. These apps that are designed to benefit your mental health. And whilst there are some problems, they do tend to work vaguely. Yeah, but vaguely though, to help people in improve their lives. So even a few weeks ago on the psychology news section, I was talking about modern problems, and that's something that actually comes up today. Today though, but there are massive benefits of living in a modern digital age. So it's very good. It's very interesting. And if you are on a health kick, maybe download an app. So I really hope that you enjoyed the psychology news section. So let's move on to the personal update. So we're moving on to the personal update. So as I mentioned in the introduction part of the episode, well, I'm currently home alone at my student house, and I mean first of all, it's really weird actually being alone, because I basically had my best friend living up with me for the past 6 weeks, and I mean it's quite something to go through. Literally, always having someone by your side, basically 24/7, to literally being home alone. And I mean there are some lovely aspects to it. I've been able to do so much. I've been able to do 7-hour working days, doing different projects. I've been able to do 10,000 steps. I've been able to do X, Y, and Z. Because the great thing about having a best friend living with you is that you're always talking to them though. So even though I used to do 4-hour days anyway, it's really nice to be able to do an extra 3 hours, do tons of different projects. Because I'm doing some fiction projects, I'm doing quite a few non-fiction projects, including writing lots of different blog posts on a very particular topic, because I also need some more fact-based chapters for an upcoming psychology book. And I've also been working on one of my mental health papers. So what this research was that it was a qualitative study aimed at transgender mental health. Mental health, when it comes to names and a whole bunch of other things. And I mean, data collection finished 2 months ago, and it's only now I'm actually starting to write any of the paper. So my supervisor comes off annual leave on the 20th. Now, I will not be done by the 20th, but I should be done by the 31st. First though, and I mean, like, this is really good at paper. It's really good. Like, I'm really pleased, like, with it. I've got two more questions I need to thematically analyze. Then I've got to create the codes. I need to create the themes. Then I've got to actually start writing it up because I've done all the quantitative stuff for my study. So now it's just like doing the thematic analysis and a whole bunch of other stuff. But here's a little tip I have though. So if you're doing some sort of online survey, at the end of your study, try and give your participants one question, which can be something along the lines of, is there any other information that you want the researchers to know? That was the best thing I've ever seen on a research study that I took a part in. Plus, it's one of the best things I've ever added because, because to be honest, no one really answers it, but some people do, and they can give you some brilliant quotes if you're doing qualitative research. Which there's two I really want to try and fit in my paper, because it does show a lot of nuance that some of my original questions just didn't. But one of these two quotes gave me a brilliant idea for my next paper and my next research study that I have not seen anywhere. I've not thought about it, and I had to talk had to talk about it to like one of my friends. One of my friends like last night at a social group, and he couldn't quite understand it either. But when we both started thinking about it, we were like, "Oh wow, that's actually brilliant. That would make a brilliant study." So that's just a little tip though. If you do academic research at all. And I also submitted the final revisions of an academic article that I was writing for a journal. Well, a journal though, so that should be getting published at some point. Well, I think it's some point before the end of the year that the academic journals are going to like publish it. Well, which is really good, and I'm really happy like with that because I definitely like learned a lot through the peer review process, and I do want to do a podcast episode on it in the future because I learned a lot. So hopefully, so will all of you. That's definitely going to be in the future. And as always, I always love to know your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment at the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast. And you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi Whiteley. I always love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And you can also leave a comment on the Facebook post or LinkedIn post. And today's episode has been sponsored by Biological Psychology. So this is a great sponsor for today's episode because not only are we focusing on how our biology impacts our behaviour and also how psychological processes impact our physical body, but so that this great, really easy to understand book will actually help you develop a deeper knowledge about how our biology impacts our behaviour. But the book also covers like a wide range of different topics. For example, hormones and neurotransmitters, which are a critical topic for today's episode. But then we also talk about evolution, our sex drives, our primal urges, pheromones, and many more biological processes that have a massive impact on our behaviour. So if you want a deeper understanding of how our biology impacts our behaviour, then definitely check it out. So that's Biological Psychology, available from all major ebook retailers, and you can order the paperback and hardback version from Amazon, your local bookstore or local library if you request it. And you can get the audiobook narrated by artificial intelligence from selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Kobo, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and selected library systems like Bibliotheca, Baker & Taylor, and Overdrive. So whilst buying books helps support the creation and the editing of the podcast, my time is sponsored by my wonderful patrons, And as always, a massive thank you to my patrons, as your support shows that you like the show and you want it to continue. So if you wanted to become a patron of the show and get access to tons of great rewards, now you can at patreon.com/the Psychology World Podcast. Or if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Con Wiley. So that's enough of the personal update. Let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So we're moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about how does trauma affect the heart. It's a great episode. I'm really excited about this. So let's dive into it. Brief introduction to trauma. Whilst I talk about trauma on the podcast a fair bit, I wanted to briefly recap the importance of a trauma within clinical psychology in case there are any new listeners or readers tuning into this episode. Therefore, trauma is the term given to an extremely difficult experience in a person's life that has a profound impact on them. This can include being involved in or witnessing life-threatening diseases, severe injuries or accidents, assaults, sexual violence, and the death of the loved ones, and so on. As well as trauma is common within a society, with at least 50% of adults in the United States experiencing one or more traumas in their life, with score in all 2022. Also, I've mentioned in a previous podcast episode, this is why trauma-informed approaches are so important, because they're about recognizing trauma is common and we need to support people. Furthermore, I'm guilty of this too, but when it comes to trauma, we particularly only think about trauma as a psychological concept with psychological impacts, which, come to think of it, doesn't make a lot of sense, since traumatic events are physical, tangible events that happen to a person, so it makes no sense why its impact would only be psychological in nature. In this podcast episode, you're going to be learning about the physical impacts of psychological trauma and why we need to acknowledge their existence. Since if we ignore the physiological impacts of a trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, then this could prove deadly for our clients. Why is trauma a mind-body condition? To some extent, I have no issue with the current official and extremely oversimplified dialogue about psychological trauma. It is very focused on psychological and mental experiences of trauma. You only need to look at the DSM-5 to see how trauma focuses on the intense emotional and behavioural responses that the traumatic event causes. For example, the PTSD and acute stress disorder symptoms, as listed in the DSM-5, focus on the anxiety, avoidance of trauma-related stimuli and situations, and hypervigilance. Personally, I have no issue with that whatsoever, because these are the things I severely struggled with after my sexual assault. Like, Monday was really bad. I can't tell you what actually happened Monday, but I didn't read a trigger warning properly, so I watched something thinking, oh, it's fine. Like, it's just like a romance. No. No. Oh, PTSD kicked in quite badly there. And these intense emotions and severe behavioural responses are horrific at times and rather debilitating. It was only 3 nights ago at the time of writing when I was watching a romance and I didn't read the trigger warnings and I watched and I saw a sex scene. I screamed, panicked and I felt paralysed for 20 minutes, just dealing with the perfectly innocent scene I had just witnessed. Yeah, that was bad. Needless to say, I am going to be reading the trigger warnings a lot more carefully in the future. However, the issue is that trauma probably needs to be reconceptualized a little more, because there is a growing body of neuroscience research showing how trauma has a major impact on our biology and our physical body. Donnell, 2016. Now, there are some researchers saying a trauma has a keyword, greater physical impact than the psychological impact, and I have some thoughts on this argument. I have no doubt there is research demonstrating how significant and damaging trauma is on our physical body. Because we actually do an entire podcast episode on it today. But as someone who has experienced two types of trauma in their life, and these are quite major traumas, I have to admit I don't buy this argument because it is the anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, suicidal idealization, and on and on and on that causes me to struggle because of my trauma. It is the intense emotion and psychological aspects of dealing with being sexually assaulted that causes me to be paralyzed at times as I deal with the intrusive thoughts and physical sensations of what happened to me. So it is the psychological aspects that hurt me the most. The only physical aspects of the trauma I really have to deal with is the sweating, increased heart rate, and rapid breathing whenever I have a panic attack, as well as the physical sensations of my body effectively remembering what he did to me, amongst a few other bits. And I don't doubt all these physical trauma responses having a physical impact on my body, but to say physical impacts are the most damaging and the most painful for a trauma survivor just doesn't sit right with me whatsoever. You might disagree, but this is my lived experience. Also, one of the areas most impacted by trauma is the heart. How does psychological trauma impact the cardiovascular system? As you can imagine, whenever we experience a traumatic event, the brain activates a fight, flight, freeze response, which is a biological process. During this process, the pituitary gland, hypothalamus, and adrenal glands, typically referred to as the HPA axis, work together to produce a powerful and rapid stress response that floods the body with neurotransmitters and hormones in an effort to protect us and save us. It is these hormones and neurotransmitters that are believed to alter the normal functioning of major organs, including the heart. Interestingly, whilst our fight or flight response is meant to save us during traumatic events, it can be deadly too. Due to there are times when people have had heart attacks as well as strokes during natural disasters, as it is possible to die from stress-induced cardiovascular events. There are even times when these cardiovascular events kill more people than the natural disasters in question. Babi and al. 2021. In addition, whilst our flight or fight response is a biological mechanism that evolved as an emergency response to help our ancestors thrive, our ancestors were almost always able to rest and recover after the activation of this mechanism, whereas in this modern era, we cannot do that because of the chronic stress. This is a modern problem because modern trauma and modern stressful events mean that the fight or flight response gets activated more often, so this response can be activated for months or even years after the traumatic event. And I know this might sound strange or impossible, but I do agree with it, since I sort of believe my fight or flight response is only just starting to calm down after 17 weeks after being assaulted. But whenever I go outside, whenever I go into certain situations, and whenever I'm inside, yes, I get there's a contradiction there, but that's how weird trauma is, to be fair. And even more when I'm in a locked room, all the physical stress responses return, and I am on high alert. I didn't actually include this in the podcast episode, but I went out for dinner with my parents to a restaurant, and originally we were sitting outside. I was really relaxed, but then because there were mice, because there were mice outside the restaurant, we went inside. Like, to be honest, I don't know why we just didn't like leave then. Oh yeah, because we wanted to have like a nice time though, and because we were so we were inside for starters. Because I was inside, and there was a whole bunch of other stresses. How I did not have a meltdown in the restaurant was beyond me, but I had a complete and utter meltdown when I got back here, and after I went up our stairs for the night. That was just that was just bad. So yeah, fight, flight, freeze response is always available to you. So we're going back to the blog post. I know if I need to escape in case someone hurts me again, my body is only a second away from activating my fight or flight response, as well as there being plenty of major incidences over the past 17 weeks where I have been okay in one moment, something small has happened, and then I freaked out and my flight or fight response has been activated. I doubt my response has been vested at all in the past 17 weeks. Therefore, with humans not vesting and being able to recover from each activation of our fight or flight response, our physical body is getting battered by our endless stress responses. This means our cardiovascular system and heart slowly becomes dysfunctional and damaged, so this raises the risk of heart attack and stroke over time. Why is the trauma heart relationship bidirectional? Lastly, what's interesting about trauma and its physical impact is that trauma is both a cause and an outcome of heart problems. Due to there is research like Edmondson and Lorcan 2017 showing a strong link between trauma and chronic and acute cardiovascular risk, as well as there is separate evidence showing how strokes and heart attacks cause trauma reactions amongst other survivors. O'Donnell and all 2021. This shows that the trauma-heart relationship is bidirectional and they can both cause and be a consequence of each other. However, the issue with trauma and cardiovascular health problems is that because trauma is psychological in nature, as are the emotional and behavioral responses, these aren't assessed in emergency rooms or cardiovascular wards. This means the trauma symptoms that are causing clients a massive amount of psychological distress and are causing further damage to their heart, these are not being treated, meaning the cardiovascular damage and the trauma symptoms simply continue. Which is why I flat out love holistic work and the biopsychosocial model, despite the jokes of it being the bio model. And I'm an idealist at heart, so I believe in the aim of the biopsychosocial model. Conclusion. On the whole, if you take anything away from today's episode, it needs to be that trauma survivors and other people experiencing chronic and acute stress need to be educated on how to reduce potential cardiovascular risk, and they need to be treated, as well as whenever someone goes into a medical setting to have treatment for a cardiovascular health related problem, they should be screened and assessed for psychological trauma so they can be helped, supported, and their trauma treated if needed so their cardiovascular symptoms don't get worse. Now, of course, I'm very cynical when it comes to medical settings embracing psychological concepts, because most medical settings, in my experience, are ruled over by white older men who firmly believe in the biomedical model and they have little time nor patience for psychology. There's absolutely nothing wrong with older white men, but I wish they were more accepting towards psychology concepts. Anyway, a great argument to make to them and other medical directors about this issue might be to mention if you spend the time and money assessing clients for trauma and treating early on, it means their symptoms will not get worse. They won't need as long or as intensive medical treatment, and they can be discharged from the hospital sooner. That means that the hospital can save money, which is something hospitals and medical settings love. I don't blame them at all because their budgets are beyond awful at this point. But ultimately, I want to mention that I know a lot of this podcast episode doesn't directly apply to us aspiring or qualified psychologists because we're trained to become experts in psychological matters, so our knowledge about physical health is limited, and I don't always think that's a bad thing. Since the worst thing that could happen with this neuroscience research is that people use it to shift trauma treatment into the biomedical model, where the main focus is on the physical symptoms, the hormones, and the neurotransmitters and everything that is physically happening to a client. That will not work for trauma treatment, but people like to try. Of course, there always needs to be psychoeducation about trauma and how it impacts a client physically, especially when it comes to PTSD, panic attacks, and anxiety. Yeah, I think it's okay that psychologists mainly focus on the psychological aspect instead of letting the medical doctors rush in and focus on the biological aspects, like they do for depression with the antidepressants that don't actually work. I still love Moncrief and Reed 2022 for their brilliant work against the biomedical model for depression. If you've not read it, read that paper. It's the only paper besides my own I'm ever going to recommend. Anyway, the real point of this episode is twofold. Firstly, we need to become aware, appreciative, and acknowledge that psychological trauma has a physical impact. Secondly, we need to pressure medical settings to realize psychological trauma impacts physical health, and if we want to save lives, improve the physical health of a client, and decrease cardiovascular related health problems that cost medical settings a lot of money each year, then psychologists and medical doctors need to work together as equal partners to help tackle the physical aspects of trauma. Awareness is always a good first step towards change. Ultimately, I've mentioned on the podcast a lot of times how trauma is common in society, and I am a total fan person of trauma-informed approaches that we are starting to shift towards in clinical psychology. Therefore, if we fail to appreciate the physiological impact that psychological trauma has on a person, then we are not only negatively impacting the physical health of our clients, but we could be risking major public health consequences with an increase in cardiovascular related deaths, something we have to avoid at all costs. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and you got something out of it. I know that I did because trauma is just something that I love. Trauma psychology is just for me, it's really fun to look at because I've been through most of this. I deal with this every single day of my life at the moment, and this is basically become a major part of my life. So this is a fun little outlet that I can play around with. I can educate myself. I can educate other people, and sometimes this can be really healing for me. Of course, sometimes it can be absolutely so destroying for me. But this is fun for me. And even though I'm having a massive break from trauma on the podcast at the moment, like eating disorders might make an appearance next week because there's a podcast episode I've been meaning to do on it for quite a while. But I've not got around to it because it's a big topic that I want to do. But this is fun and I really hope that you learn something. Also, if you know someone who would like today's episode and find it useful, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the podcast. And if you want to learn more, definitely check out Biological Psychology, available in all the usual places. And if you want to become a patron of the show and support the podcast on a monthly basis, which you can stop and start whenever, then please check out patreon.com/The Psychology World Podcast. Or if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you found it helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow the podcast on your favourite podcast app. And if you wanted to learn more, then please check out the backlist of the podcast episodes or my books at conwhiteley.net. So have a great day and I'll see you next time.